The morning after the old guard fell, Detroit didn't wake up to the sound of celebration. It woke up to a vacuum. The sun rose over the Detroit River, a cold, pale disk that offered no warmth to the glass-shattered remains of the Windsor salt mines across the water. In the penthouse above the city, the silence was louder than the sirens had ever been. Amara Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breath fogging the glass. She was still wearing the charcoal suit from the trial, now wrinkled and smelling of the ozone and spent brass from the night before. Her hands, though healed from the lie burns of her past, felt heavy. She watched a flock of birds fly over the river, oblivious to the fact that the invisible threads governing the city had been snapped. The patents were out, the data was public, but the world didn't change overnight. Instead, it braced itself for the impact of a falling empire. Amara reached out, tracing a line through the condensation on the window. She thought about the millions of people who had just received the notification on their phones, the blueprints for insulin, the water filtration systems, the legacy of her parents. She expected to feel a sense of completion, but all she felt was the cold glass against her fingertip. The chemistry queen was no longer a ghost in Sang-wook's kitchen, but she wasn't quite a savior yet either. She was a woman standing in the eye of a storm, waiting for the wind to change direction. "They told me that once the truth was out, the weight would lift," she whispered to her reflection. But the truth isn't a cure, it's a catalyst. Every major pharmaceutical board in the world is currently in emergency session. Every hedge fund that bet on Aegis stock is looking for someone to blame. I didn't just break a window, I pulled the foundation out from under a global monopoly. And now, as the city holds its breath, I'm waiting to see who the rubble falls on first. I wanted to be a doctor to heal people, but I ended up a chemist to survive. Now I have to be something else entirely. I have to be the one who keeps the lights on when the ghosts come back for their gold. Ji-Hu Thorne entered the room with the silent, heavy gait of a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. The shadow boss of Detroit looked different in the morning light, less like a predator and more like a weary protector. He carried 2 heavy ceramic mugs of coffee, the steam rising in the chilled air of the penthouse. He didn't say a word as he handed one to Amara. His knuckles were bruised, a dark purple reminder of the final breach in the salt mines. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. For a moment, they weren't the chemist and the boss, they were just 2 survivors looking at the wreckage of a war they had barely won. "You're thinking about the what comes next," Ji-Hu said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to ground her. "I'm thinking about the fact that I just made 10,000 enemies who all have private jets and mercenary payrolls," Amara replied, taking a sip of the bitter black coffee. "The federal marshals have officially moved in on the remaining Aegis facilities. They're freezing assets, seizing servers, and taking statements from the middle managers who are suddenly eager to save their own skins. But we have a problem that the marshals aren't equipped to handle. Madam Park's secondary servers in Singapore just went active at 4 a.m. She had a dead man's switch we didn't account for in the initial breach. It was hidden in a tertiary layer of the Windsor core." Amara turned, her eyes sharp and focused, the exhaustion momentarily pushed aside by her analytical mind. "A dead man's switch? I thought we wiped the hub. I wrote the corrosive script myself. There shouldn't be a single bit of Aegis data left on a reachable server. I calculated the wipe to include every redundancy." "It wasn't designed to protect data, Amara," Ji-Hu replied, his face a mask of cold iron. "It was designed to release payment. A massive, untraceable cryptocurrency transfer went out the moment the Windsor hub collapsed. It was pre-authorized payment to the Vulture Syndicate. They are the international arm of the Old Guard's wet work, men who don't care about Detroit's politics, city contracts, or the results of a probate trial. They are professional liquidators. Madam Park knew she might lose the trial, so she prepaid for our disappearance. We aren't just looking at local thugs or Sang-wook's street-level enforcers anymore. We're looking at ghosts who hunt for a living, and they've already been paid in full. To them, we aren't people, we're unfinished business." Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. So the trial was just the beginning. They're coming for the foundation before we can even open the doors. They want to bury the future before it can take root. They're already here, Ji-Hu said, gesturing to a tablet on the table. Look at the IP pings on the public patent servers. Someone isn't just downloading the insulin formulas, they're injecting a corrupted script back into the source files. They're trying to poison the public data. If a small lab in a developing country tries to manufacture this insulin using the current online files, the chemical ratios will be slightly off. It won't heal people, it'll cause systemic organ failure. They want to make the world afraid of our gift. They want to turn our liberation into a bioterror event. The Vance-Thorne Foundation building, a monolithic structure of glass and steel that once housed the Aegis elite, was now a hive of frantic, nervous activity. Amara moved through the labs, the scent of antiseptic and high-grade plastic filling her senses. She wasn't looking at beakers today, she was looking at the security feeds. She knew the piece was a lie. In the corner of the main research wing, she found a young man she had hired 3 days prior, Kalen, a brilliant but erratic coder who had been blacklisted by every tech firm in the city for his unauthorized audits of city power usage. He was staring at a screen that looked like a waterfall of cascading red text. "Amara, you need to see this," Kalen said, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with a sound like hailstones on a tin roof. "I was tracking the pings. The corruption isn't coming from an outside hack. It's coming from the Detroit water and sewerage infrastructure. Someone has tapped into the old fiber optic lines that run parallel to the water mains. They're inside the pipes, Amara. Literally, they're using the city's own underground geography to mask their signal. They've built a parasite server right into the municipal nervous system." Amara leaned over her shoulder, her mind racing through the chemical implications of the corrupted data Kalen was showing her. They've changed the molecular weight of the binding agent in the formula. Look at the carbon chain sequence. To a casual eye, it looks like a standard adjustment for temperature stability, but in a centrifuge, it will separate and become toxic. This is the old guard's true revenge. They don't have to win the lawsuit. They just have to destroy the trust. If one batch kills a patient in Mumbai or Rio, the Vance name is dead forever. "Can we trace it to a specific junction?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and fury. "Junction 42, Kalen replied, pointing to a digital map of the city's subterranean veins. "It's a dead zone for GPS and cellular signals. If they have a mobile server down there, they can keep poisoning the data indefinitely. We can't block them from here. We have to sever the physical connection." Ji-Hu and Min-ho geared up in the sub-basement at the foundation. The Woodward convoy was no longer about armored SUVs on the street. It was about the dark, wet, and dangerous arteries beneath the city. They checked their weapons, suppressed, high-caliber, and loaded with non-lethal rounds for Amara's sake, though the syndicate wouldn't offer the same courtesy. The air down there is stagnant, sulfur, methane, and God knows what else. The tunnels under Corktown haven't been inspected since the riots. If we get into a firefight, the muzzle flashes could trigger an explosion if there's a gas leak from an old main. We move quiet, we move fast, and we don't use high-yield explosives. Amara pulled on a tactical jacket over her lab coat, the weight of the respirator hanging around her neck. "I'm the only one who can verify the purge. If we just blow the junction, the data might remain in the cache. I have to manually override the server at the source and verify the molecular handshake. I'm not leaving this to chance." The descent into the tunnels was a journey into a different kind of Detroit. They moved through a heavy iron hatch in the basement and down a series of rusted ladders that seemed to go on for miles. The temperature dropped and the air became heavy and damp. The only light came from the pulsing red glow of their tactical flashlights, reflecting off the slick, salt-encrusted walls of the tunnels. It was a labyrinth of brick and iron, a forgotten world that had been built long before the skyscrapers above it. As they moved deeper toward Junction 42, the sound of rhythmic splashing echoed from the darkness ahead. It wasn't the sound of water dripping from a pipe. It was the sound of heavy boots moving through shallow pools.
out of the shadows emerged a group of specialized mercenaries, their gear far more advanced than anything Sang-wook had ever fielded. They wore silent step boots and high-end rebreathers, their eyes glowing with the green light of night vision goggles. "The Syndicate," Ji-Hu whispered, his weapon coming up in a smooth, practiced motion. "Min-ho, take the left flank. Amara, get behind the reinforced junction box and stay low. This isn't a conversation, it's a liquidation." The firefight in the tunnels was a claustrophobic nightmare. The sound of suppressed fire was muffled by the heavy, damp air, creating a series of dull thuds that vibrated through the stone. Amara crawled through the freezing water, her fingers gripping her portable tablet. Bullets sparked off the iron pipes above her, showering her in orange sparks. She reached the junction terminal, a modern high-tech server rack that looked grotesquely out of place in the 19th century tunnel. "I have the uplink," she shouted over the roar of a bursting steam pipe
I'm
that filled
initiating
the
the
tunnel
purge,
with a blinding
but they've
white
installed
fog.
a physical override on the board. Ji-Hu, I need 30 seconds at the main breaker. If the power doesn't cut, the script will finish the corruption. Ji-Hu moved like a force of nature through the mist. He didn't just fire his weapon, he used the environment, kicking a loose iron grate into a mercenary's path and using the steam to mask his advance. He reached the breaker just as a syndicate operative lunged from a side pipe with a serrated combat knife. Ji-Hu caught the man's wrist in a grip that sounded like snapping dry wood, neutralized him with a brutal efficiency, and slammed the breaker handle down with a concussive clack. The red text on Amara's screen flickered, sputtered, and finally turned a brilliant, steady green. Purge complete. Source protected.
They emerged from the tunnels 3 hours later into a rainy Detroit night, covered in grime, salt, and the soot of the underground. But as they reached the surface, they weren't met with the silence of the night. They were met with the harsh, blinding lights of news trucks. The poison patent story had already broken. The media wasn't reporting on the purge. They were showing images of a corrupted insulin vial from a lab in Brazil. The old guard hadn't just attacked the data, they had attacked the reputation of the Vance name before the truth could even catch up. Amara looked at the cameras, her face streaked with soot and her hair damp from the tunnels. She realized then that the war wasn't going to be won in a salt mine or a sewer. It was going to be won in the hearts of the people who were now terrified of the very medicine she had sacrificed everything to give them. "They're turning the city against us," Amara said, her eyes fixed on a headline that read, "The cost of amateur chemistry, lives at risk." "Then we give them something they can't twist," Ji-Hu replied, his hand resting on her shoulder. "The Woodward Grid. We turn the power back on in the neighborhoods they've left in the dark for years. We show them that the Vance-Thorne name doesn't just mean medicine, it means independence." The Brightmoor district of Detroit was a place where the city's official maps seemed to stop, or at least where the ink began to fade into a series of jagged, uncertain lines. It was a grid of cracked asphalt and overgrown lots, where the streetlights had been dead for so long that the residents had forgotten what it felt like to walk home under anything but the moonlight or the harsh, flickering glare of a passing squad car. This was the territory the old guard had abandoned decades ago, deeming it unprofitable to maintain and impossible to control. It was exactly where Amara Vance chose to plant the first hub. If the insulin was her father's legacy, the Woodward Grid was her mother's dream, a way to ensure that no one in Detroit would ever have to choose between keeping their food cold and keeping their children warm. The Vance-Thorne Foundation's trucks arrived at midnight. They didn't move with sirens or flashing lights, they moved with a low electric hum, a convoy of heavy, reinforced vehicles carrying the monolithic structure of brushed steel and solar glass. Amara stood in the center of an abandoned parking lot on Fenkel Avenue, her boots sinking into the thick, oily mud that never seemed to dry in this part of town. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet concrete, and the metallic tang of impending rain. In front of her, the Woodward hub stood 10 feet tall, its surface reflecting the dull, orange glow of the distant downtown skyline like a silent sentinel.
If this works, Amara said, her voice barely a whisper as she watched Kaylin connect the final superconducting cables, this block becomes the first place in America where the people own their own electrons. No utility bills, no corporate shutoffs, no old guard oversight. We aren't just giving them power, Kaylin, we're giving them the means to refuse to be controlled. Every light that flickers on tonight is a vote of no confidence in the people who left them in the dark. Kaylin was sweating despite the biting cold, his breath coming in short, anxious puffs of white vapor that vanished into the darkness. The local utility company just filed an emergency safety hazard report with the city council, Amara. They're claiming the hub is an unshielded radiation risk and a fire hazard to the surrounding homes. Holloway's replacements at the precinct have already signed a summary demolition order. We have maybe 4 hours before the riot squads show up with a crane to tear this thing out of the ground. They aren't going to let us disrupt their monopoly without a fight. Ji-Hu was on the perimeter, a silent shadow leaning against the rusted, skeletal frame of a derelict playground set. His eyes weren't on the hub, they were scanning the jagged, uneven rooftops of the surrounding warehouses and the empty windows of the boarded-up tenements. He didn't like the stillness of the night. It felt manufactured, like the heavy silence that precedes a predator's strike. "They'll send the police first, Kaylin," Ji-Hu said, his hand resting with practiced ease on the grip of his holstered sidearm. "The police are for the cameras. The syndicate is for the result. They'll send a message that the neighborhood can't ignore before the uniforms ever arrive to clean up the mess." As if on cue, a single, needle-thin red laser dot appeared on the steel side of the hub. It danced erratically for a split second, a digital spark in the dark, before settling with terrifying mechanical stillness on the center of Amara's chest. "Sniper! Get down!" Ji-Hu roared, launching himself across the muddy lot with the explosive force of a coiled spring. He tackled Amara into the dirt, just as a high-velocity round tore through the air where her head had been a second before. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a whip crack of displaced air, followed by the sound of the round shattering the heavy glass of a nearby truck. The parking lot erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. This wasn't a tactical stack of mercenaries moving in formation. This was a long-range execution attempt designed to be clean, final, and anonymous. Ji-Hu pulled a smoke grenade from his tactical vest and triggered it, filling the muddy lot with a thick, acrid gray veil that tasted of sulfur and grit. "Min-ho, northwest corner, height of the old grain silo," Ji-Hu barked into his comms, his voice a cold, sharp command over the sound of a second shot hitting the hub's reinforced casing with a metallic clang. Amara crawled through the freezing mud, the cold seeping through her jumpsuit as her fingers clawed at the earth until she reached the hub's recessed control panel. "I have to activate it now. If the power goes live, the electromagnetic surge from the initial capacitor discharge will fry their thermal tracking and drown out their sensors. It's the only way to blind them." "It's too dangerous. The surge could blow the primary circuit if the grounds aren't set," Kaylin yelled, pinned behind the heavy wheel of a transport truck. "I have to do," Amara shouted back, her voice ringing with a desperation that was rapidly turning into steel. She reached the panel, her fingers slick with oil and Michigan clay. She entered the final sequence, the complex, multi-layered encryption her father had written in the margins of his Bible, a code that required the molecular weight of the insulin formula as its primary key. The hub didn't just turn on, it detonated with light. A pulse of pure, clean energy surged through the newly laid underground lines, vibrating through the soles of Amara's boots and into the very bedrock of the city. For 3 blocks in every direction, the dead streetlights didn't just flicker, they blazed with a brilliant white intensity that turned night into day. The abandoned houses, once hollow shells of brick and rot, suddenly glowed from the inside as old circuits were revitalized by the massive surge. The sniper on the silo was momentarily blinded by the massive light signature and the electromagnetic interference that scrambled his digital scope. It was the only opening Min-ho needed. A single suppressed shot echoed from the darkness of a nearby alleyway, and the red laser dot on the hub vanished as the shooter collapsed. Amara stood up in the center of the illuminated parking lot, her lab coat ruined, her face smeared with mud, and people were coming out of their houses, first one, then dozens, then nearly 100. Their faces were a complex mixture of terror, confusion, and a burgeoning, fragile sense of wonder. They looked at the girl in the muddy coat and the stoic man standing over her with a rifle, and for the first time in generations, the people of Brightmoor saw someone fighting for them instead of over them. "It's your power now," Amara shouted, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet street with an authority she had never known she possessed. "It belongs to the neighborhood. They can't shut you off anymore. You own the light." But the victory was as fragile as a glass filament. From the shadows of the alleyway directly opposite the hub, a new figure emerged. He wasn't wearing the tactical gear of the syndicate or the rough clothes of the neighborhood. He was wearing a gray, perfectly tailored Savile Row suit and carried a slim silver briefcase. He walked into the circle of brilliant white light with a terrifying, calm confidence that made Ji-Hu's eyes narrow into slits. "My name is Julian Vane," he said, his voice a perfect, polished echo of Sang-wook's, but with a layer of Ivy League sophistication that made it even more dangerous. "I'm Sang-wook's son, the one he didn't keep in the kitchen because I had a better use for a pen than a sponge. And I'm not here to kill you tonight, Amara. I'm here to serve you. Specifically, I'm here to sue you for the intellectual property rights of that hub. My father didn't just steal your money, he patented your parents' thoughts while you were still in middle school. You just built a billion-dollar asset for Vane Logistics, and you did it on my dime." The revelation hit Amara harder than the sniper's bullet ever could. Julian Vane was the clean version of the family, the one who had been sent to Harvard and then to London to distance himself from the Detroit grit. He was the old guard's legal failsafe, a ghost who lived in the world of patents, shell companies, and international arbitration. "You can't patent a crime, Julian," Amara hissed, standing her ground despite the mud, the exhaustion, and the trembling in her limbs. "I didn't patent a crime, Amara. I'm much more thorough than my father ever was," Julian replied, opening his briefcase to reveal a stack of stamped federal documents that looked as lethal as any weapon in Ji-Hu's arsenal. "I patented the subsurface energy transfer protocol in 2019. Your parents aren't on these documents, only my father's. Every hub you build, every electron you move through this neighborhood is a royalty payment to me. You aren't a revolutionary, Amara.
You're just a very gifted, very unpaid employee of Vane Logistics. You're working for me now. Just like you were back on Elmwood Drive, only the kitchen is much larger." Ji-Hu stepped forward, his body language a silent, vibrating threat that seemed to push back against the very light of the hub. "The contracts your father signed were produced under duress and systematic fraud. We've already proven that in a criminal court. Those patents are fruit of a poison tree." "In a criminal court, yes," Julian said with a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But in a patent court? In the world of intellectual property? That takes decades, Mr. Thorne. By the time you win, the syndicate will have already picked the bones of this city clean, and I'll be sitting in a boardroom in Geneva. I'm not my father. I don't care about revenge or scrubbing copper pots. I care about the recurring revenue of human survival. And currently, you're providing it for free. You want to save Detroit? Fine. Just make sure my check is in the mail by the 1st of the month."
Julian turned on his heel, his expensive shoes clicking with rhythmic precision against the wet asphalt. "I'll see you in court on Monday. Or better yet, I'll see you back in my kitchen. I hear the silver needs a proper polishing." The battle shifted back to the Foundation's war room. For 48 hours, Amara and Ji-Hu didn't leave the building. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee, cold takeout, and the constant low-level hum of high-end servers running in maximum capacity. They dug through every digital archive, every shell company, and every hidden folder Julian had cited in his legal brief. "He's right," Ji-Hu said, rubbing his bloodshot eyes and staring at the glowing screens.
The patents were filed under a shell company called Aegis-Alpha. It's a tertiary subsidiary, legally insulated from Sang-wook's personal criminal record. To break it, we need more than testimony. We need the source key, the original physical schematics signed and dated by their father before Sang-wook altered them. If we can find the original blueprints with the 1997 timestamp, Julian's entire legal house of cards collapses instantly. "Where are they?" Amara asked, her voice tight with a mixture of desperation and growing resolve. "There was a private safety deposit box in the old Detroit Savings Bank," Chan-ho said, pulling up a historical map of the downtown district. "But that building was demolished in 2010 to make way for the new stadium. The vault wasn't destroyed, though. It was too expensive to remove, so they reinforced it and built around it. It's buried 30 feet under the home team's locker room at Ford-Vane Stadium." Ji-Hu looked up from his monitors, his face lit by the blue, ghostly glow of the city's surveillance grid. "The stadium is owned by a Vulture Syndicate front company. They've built their entire international headquarters on top of the only thing that can destroy them. They didn't just build a stadium, they built a bunker disguised as a sports arena." Amara looked at the brass key hanging around her neck, the key that had opened the floorboards of her home and started this entire journey. She realized it wasn't the end of the road, it was just the beginning of a heist. "Then we don't go as lawyers," Amara said, her eyes reflecting the glowing blueprints on the screen. "We go as a tactical team. If the truth is buried under 500 tons of concrete and 6,000 syndicate sensors, then we're going to need to do more than file a subpoena. We're going to need to shut the whole city down." The plan to breach Ford-Vane Stadium was not born out of a desire for a cinematic heist. It was born out of a cold mathematical necessity. Amara spent the next 72 hours in a fever dream of architectural blueprints, electromagnetic theory, and structural acoustics. The stadium was a marvel of modern engineering, a glass and steel crown sitting atop the city's skyline, but every marvel has a shadow. Julian Vane had turned the substructure into a fortress, but he had relied on a singular, arrogant assumption that no one would be bold enough to strike while 60,000 witnesses were cheering above their heads. "The locker rooms are the weakest point in the physical security matrix," Min-ho explained, his laser pointer tracing the ventilation shafts on the holographic display in the Foundation's war room. "Because of the high humidity from the hydrotherapy pools and showers, the biometric scanners in that sector have a 0.4% higher error margin programmed into the firmware to account for steam and condensation. If we can manipulate the local atmosphere, we can broaden that margin until the system essentially goes blind to anyone without a registered thermal signature." Ji-Hu stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the security rotation cycles. "The problem isn't the locker room itself, it's the transit. To get from the service entrance to the vault, we have to pass through 3 separate checkpoints manned by syndicate contractors. They aren't stadium security, they're mercenaries with an Aegis-Alpha payroll and 0 patience. They won't ask for ID, they'll check for the subcutaneous RFID chips that only Julian's inner circle carries. If you don't ping as you walk through the frame, the automated turrets in the ceiling engage before you can even explain your presence." Amara looked up from her tablet, her eyes bloodshot but burning with a cold intellectual fire. "We don't need to bypass the chips, we need to spoof the readers. If we can generate a localized EMP burst that's focused enough not to kill the stadium's main grid, we can force the readers into a fail-open mode for exactly 6 seconds. That's our window. I've already designed the pulse generator. It's small enough to fit inside a standard toolkit." "And the noise?" Chan-ho asked, looking skeptical as he adjusted his glasses. "A vault breach of that scale involves hydraulic pressure and mechanical grinding. The seismic sensors in the floor will pick up the vibrations even through the concrete. The moment you touch that iron, every alarm in the building will scream." "Not during the halftime show," Amara replied, a small, dark smile touching her lips. "The halftime performance this Sunday is a high-decibel pyrotechnic show featuring a heavy metal lineup. The bass frequencies alone will be enough to mask a tectonic shift, let alone a vault opening. We timed the physical breach to the final crescendo of the opening act. The crowd's roar, the fireworks, and the music's vibration will provide the perfect acoustic camouflage. We hide the sound of our work inside the sound of their celebration. The preparation was a grueling marathon of technical refinement. Amara returned to her lab, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent a decade hiding her brilliance in plain sight. She wasn't mixing insulin today, she was mixing an exothermic cooling compound. It was a chemical paradox, a substance that reacted with the ambient oxygen to drop the temperature to near absolute zero in a matter of seconds. The vault's primary lock is a 1920s mechanical masterpiece, she told Ji-Hu as he watched her carefully pour a shimmering blue liquid into a series of pressurized canisters. It's built from high-carbon steel, designed to withstand drills and torches, but the steel from that era is susceptible to extreme thermal shock. If I can flash freeze the tumblers and then hit them with a high-frequency acoustic pulse, the metal will shatter like glass. No drilling, no explosives, no smoke, just chemistry. Ji-Hu watched her, a rare look of profound admiration softening his hard, scarred features. You've spent your life learning how to fix things, Amara. Now you're learning how to break them with the same precision. It's a dangerous shift. I'm not breaking the vault, Ji-Hu. I'm just reminding it of its original purpose. It was built to protect the truth from thieves. I'm just giving it the chance to do its job one last time for the rightful owners. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of snow. The atmosphere in Detroit was electric. The Detroit-Chicago game was a cultural event, a rare moment of unity for a fractured city, but for the Vance-Thorne team, it was a tactical operation. They didn't arrive in armored USVs or tactical vans. They arrived in a nondescript white maintenance truck labeled Dynamic Effects and Pyrotechnics. Amara wore a rugged technician's jumpsuit, her hair tucked under a salt-stained baseball cap, her face smudged with enough grease to look like a woman who spent her life behind a mixing board. Ji-Hu and Min-Hu were beside her, their tactical gear hidden under bulky orange work jackets. They carried heavy crates that looked like they contained speakers and fog machines, but were actually packed with Amara's chemical canisters and Ji-Hu's suppressed hardware. The service entrance was a gauntlet of tension, a syndicate guard with a jagged scar across his throat and a cold, bored expression held up a hand. ID and manifest, you're late. Ji-Hu handed over a digital tablet with a cool professional indifference that masked the lethality beneath. Dynamic effects, we're here for the halftime pyrotechnic calibration. The stage manager is already breathing down my neck because the lead singer's entrance doesn't have the stage fog density he wants. You want to be the one to tell him why his show is ruined? The guard glanced at the manifest and then at the heavy crates. He moved a handheld scanner over the boxes. Amara held her breath, her heart drumming against her ribs. Inside her sleeve, she clicked a small remote. A localized ghost signal emitted from her wrist, a low-level frequency she had recorded earlier that mimicked the RFID pulse of an authorized Aegis-Alpha contractor. The scanner chirped a friendly, high-pitched green. The guard waved them through without a word, his attention already drifting back to the game on the radio. First gate cleared, Min-Ho whispered into his comms as they pushed the heavy crates toward the service elevator. The interior of the stadium was a labyrinth of echoing concrete corridors and the distant muffled roar of 60,000 people. The vibration was constant, a low-frequency hum that Amara could feel in her teeth and her marrow. They reached the sub-level locker room area, a sterile environment of white tiles, stainless steel, and fluorescent lights that felt more like a hospital wing than a sports facility. 20 minutes to halftime, Ji-Hu said, checking his watch. Min-Ho, take the secondary exit and secure the extraction point in the parking garage. Amara, you're with me. We don't have a second to waste. They slipped into the locker room's maintenance closet, a cramped, humid space filled with industrial cleaning supplies, plumbing valves, and the smell of chlorine. Amara knelt on the floor, pulling out a high-resolution sonar scanner. She pressed it against the cold tile floor. The screen flickered to life, showing a wireframe map of the density of the ground beneath them. There it is, Amara whispered, her breath hitching. The bank vault. It's exactly where the historical map said it would be, but they've added a layer of modern reinforced polymer between the floor and the vault roof. We're going to have to cut through 3 inches of composite before we even reach the iron. Above them, the crowd's roar intensified. The game was reaching its peak.
The vibrations increased, the floor shaking as 60,000 fans jumped in unison to a touchdown. They just scored, Ji-Hu noted, his weapon drawn and pointed at the maintenance door. The noise floor is optimal. Start the cut. Amara didn't use a saw. She used a chemical torch, a mixture of thermite and a proprietary catalyst that burned at 3,000 degrees but produced almost no smoke and no light. The smell was intense, a sharp, ozone-like tang that filled the small closet. She moved the torch in a precise circle, the composite floor melting away like hot wax. 10 minutes to halftime, Ji-Hu reported, his eyes never leaving the door. The music crew is moving the stage into position on the field. The syndicate guards are rotating to the main gates to manage the crowd flow. We have a clear window. Amara pulled the circle of melted floor away, revealing the dark, rusted, and heavily reinforced iron of the 1920s vault roof. She reached for her cooling canisters, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. This is the part that has to be perfect. If the thermal shock isn't uniform across the locking mechanism, the tumblers will jam instead of shattering. We'll be locked out.
She attached the canisters to a specialized manifold she had built in the lab. She looked at Ji-Hu, her expression grim behind her goggles. On my mark, the room temp in this closet is going to drop 60 degrees in 5 seconds. Hold your breath or the vapor will sear your lungs. They pulled their tactical respirators into place. Amara hit the trigger. The canisters hissed, a geyser of white frost erupting from the manifold. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted into a void. The walls of the closet instantly turned white with frost. Amara watched the iron vault roof. She saw the metal begin to moan, the microscopic crystalline structure of the steel becoming brittle and fragile under the weight of the extreme cold. Crack! The sound was like a high-powered rifle shot, muffled by a heavy pillow. The iron had fractured. Amara picked up a heavy, rubber-coated mallet and struck the center of the fractured iron roof. The metal shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, falling into the dark, silent void of the vault below. "We're in," she said, her voice muffled and strange through the respirator. They lowered themselves into the vault. It was a space that hadn't seen light since the demolition of the bank. The air was dry and ancient, smelling of old paper, stagnant air, and the metallic tang of oxidized copper. Rows of safety deposit boxes stretched into the darkness, their brass faces dull and tarnished with age. Amara scanned the numbers with her flashlight. 108, 110, box 112, she whispered. She reached into the pocket of her jumpsuit and pulled out the brass key, the key that had opened the floorboards of her home and the Bible of her parents. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, heavy resistance that felt like history itself yielding to her. She pulled the box out. Inside was a thick, leather-bound folder and a small cylindrical device that pulsed with a faint, steady blue light. "The original blueprints," Amara said, her hand trembling as she opened the folder. She saw her father's signature, dated August 14, 1997. It was signed before the Vane Logistics shell companies were even formed. And the prototype, the kinetic core. It's the piece that makes the Woodward Grid autonomous. Without this, Julian's version is just a standard utility. With this, it's a revolution. "Amara, we have to move," Ji-Hu warned. "The halftime show is halfway through. The pyrotechnics are starting. The sensors will reset once the music stops." As if to emphasize his point, the vault shook with a series of concussive booms from above. The stadium's fireworks had begun, shaking the very foundations of the building. They climbed back into the maintenance closet and sealed the floor as best they could. They moved through the sterile corridors, the blue prototype core hidden in a lead-lined bag. They were 50 feet from the service exit when the lights in the corridor suddenly turned a harsh, pulsing, and rhythmic red. "Alert! Biometric anomaly in Sector 4. Lockdown initiated."
Julian knew, Amara whispered, her heart dropping. He didn't just rely on the sensors, he had a secondary heartbeat monitor hidden in the ventilation. Julian Vane stepped out from a side corridor, flanked by 6 men in gray tactical suits. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, as if he were catching a child stealing from a cookie jar. "You're very predictable, Amara," Julian said, his voice smooth and cold as a razor blade. "You always go for the truth, but in Detroit, the truth is just something we bury under more concrete to make the foundations stronger. Give me the folder and the core, and I might let Mr. Thorne live long enough to see you go back to the kitchen where you belong." Ji-Hu stepped in front of Amara, his body a wall of iron. "You talk too much, Julian, just like your father, but unlike him, you don't have the stomach for what happens next." The halftime show reached its final, deafening crescendo above them. In the red-lit, subterranean corridor of the stadium, the war for Detroit's future was about to get very, very loud. The red strobe lights of the stadium's sub-level corridor turned Julian Vane into a rhythmic mask of shadow and bone. Above them, the final firework of the halftime show detonated, a concussive thump that rattled the overhead pipes and sent a fine dusting of plaster from the ceiling. The air in the narrow hallway was thick with the scent of floor wax, stagnant moisture, and the electric ozone charge of the looming firefight. Julian didn't flinch, he simply adjusted his cufflinks with a slow, deliberate grace, a gesture of domesticity in a place that was about to become a slaughterhouse. "You think a folder of yellowed paper and a glowing battery change the math, Amara?" Julian asked, his voice cutting through the distant muffled roar of the fans. "The Vulture Syndicate isn't a gang you can outsmart with a chemistry set. It's a sovereign state without a flag. You can't win a war against a balance sheet that has more zeros than your foundation has bricks. Give me the core, and I'll ensure your little project remains a tax-exempt memory instead of a mass casualty event." Ji-Hu didn't waste breath on a reply. He moved with a speed that defied his heavy frame, his suppressed sidearm clearing leather before Julian's lead mercenary could even raise his rifle. The first shot was a dull, metallic thud, catching the guard in the shoulder and spinning him back against the industrial lockers. "Move! Towards the service elevator!" Ji-Hu roared, his voice booming in the confined space. The corridor erupted. The syndicate mercenaries were trained professionals, moving in a tight diamond formation that forced Ji-Hu and Amara into a desperate defensive retreat. Bullets tore into the white-tiled walls, sending shards of ceramic flying through the air like shrapnel. Amara clutched the lead-lined bag to her chest, the weight of the kinetic core pulling at her shoulder like the gravity of her parents' unfinished lives. "The elevator is locked down. The control circuits are dead," Amara shouted, her eyes scanning the ceiling as she ducked behind a heavy equipment cart. "Julian's using a local jammer to isolate this wing. We have to go through the laundry chutes, or we're trapped in this funnel until they run out of bullets." "Min-Ho, where are you?" Ji-Hu barked into his comms, his back pressed against a concrete pillar as a volley of fire shattered a nearby fire extinguisher, filling the hallway with a blinding, choking cloud of white powder. "I'm pinned at the loading dock, boss." Min-Ho's voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the sound of automatic fire. "Julian brought a second team in through the VIP entrance. They're cutting off the surface exits. You're being pushed towards the central maintenance hub. It's a dead end." Ji-Hu grabbed Amara by the collar of her technician's jumpsuit, pulling her behind a heavy industrial dumpster that smelled of wet towels and sweat. "We're not being pushed, we're choosing the ground." "Amara, that core, you said it was a kinetic prototype. Can it be triggered manually without the hub's primary capacitor?" Amara's mind raced through the physics of the device, her eyes wide as she looked at the bag. The core is a vacuum-sealed capacitor. It stores rotational energy from the Earth's magnetic field. If I bypass the internal regulator and short the primary coil, it will release a 360-degree electromagnetic pulse. It'll fry every sensor in this wing, including the electronic locks on the security gates. But it'll also fry our comms. We'll be blind and deaf. "Better blind than dead," Ji-Hu said, his eyes locking at hers with a terrifying absolute certainty. "Do it." Amara reached into the bag, her fingers finding the cold, vibrating surface of the cylindrical device. She pulled a small multi-tool from her belt and jammed it into the regulator's maintenance port. The blue light of the core shifted, deepening into a violent, pulsing violet that cast long, jagged shadows against the white tiles. The vibration increased until her teeth began to ache and the metal dumpster hummed in sympathy. 10 seconds, she yelled over the screeching metal. Close your eyes and cover your ears, or the flash will burn your retinas. Julian, seeing the core begin to glow with an unnatural intensity through the fog of the fire extinguisher powder, realized the danger. Stop her. Get that core before she shorts it. The mercenaries lunged forward, their boots thundering on the concrete, but they were too late. The core didn't explode in fire, it exploded in a wall of absolute silence. A wave of invisible energy rippled outward, a visible distortion in the air that looked like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. When the pulse hit the mercenaries, their electronic headsets shrieked with feedback before dying. The lights in the corridor didn't just flicker, they burst in a shower of sparks, plunging the sub-level into total, suffocating darkness. The electronic gates at the end of the hallway groaned, their magnetic locks losing power as the failsafes triggered. Now, Ji-Hu shouted. They sprinted through the darkness, guided only by the fading, ghostly foliate glow of the exhausted core. They reached the central maintenance hub, a cavernous, echoing room filled with massive cooling fans and the churning machinery of the stadium's climate control. The laundry chutes are behind the industrial boilers. Follow the sound of the steam, Amara directed, her voice echoing in the hollow space. They scrambled over hot pipes and under low-hanging vents, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, they could hear the frantic shouts of Julian's men as they struggled to switch to manual flashlights and backup eyesights. Amara found the chute, a massive circular stainless steel tunnel that dropped 30 feet to the basement sorting room. You first, Ji-Hu commanded, his gun sweeping the room. Amara didn't hesitate. She slid into the darkness, the cold metal slick against her jumpsuit. She hit the pile of dirty jerseys at the bottom with a muffled thud, the air knocked out of her lungs. Seconds later, Ji-Hu landed beside her, rolling to his feet with his weapon already pointed at the heavy sorting room door. We're in the basement sorting room, Amara gasped, checking her tablet. The screen was cracked and dead, a victim of the EMP. We're 2 levels below the street.
If we can reach the old steam tunnel junction, we can get back to the Woodward Grid. Julian won't follow us there, not without a small army to clear the gas pockets. They moved through the basement, a maze of narrow hallways and humming electrical panels. As they reached the rusted door to the steam tunnels, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was Julian. He was alone, his suit dusty and disheveled, his face twisted in a look of pure, academic hatred. He held a small, high-caliber pistol aimed directly at Amara's head. He had taken the service stairs while they were in the chute. You've cost me $3 billion in the last 10 minutes, Amara, Julian said, his voice trembling with a controlled, rhythmic rage. The patents, the core, the reputation of Aegis-Alpha. You've burned it all for a city that doesn't even know your name. Did you really think you could walk out of my house with the family silver? Ji-Hu stepped between them, his own gun lowered to his side. Julian, look around you. The grid is down. Your men are blind. You're alone in the dark with a man who has nothing to lose. Put the gun down, and you can walk away with enough of your dignity to find a new career. Or keep it up, and you'll find out why they called my father a monster.
Julian laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the concrete. Dignity? I'm a Vane. We don't have dignity, we have ownership. If I can't own the future, then no one will live to see it. Julian's finger tightened on the trigger. Amara didn't wait for Ji-Hu to fire. She reached into her belt and pulled out a small glass vial, the exothermic cooling compound she had developed for the vault. She didn't throw it at Julian, she threw it at the high-pressure steam pipe running directly above his head. The glass shattered against the iron with a musical tink. The reaction was instantaneous. The cooling compound reacted with the pressurized steam, causing a catastrophic, localized thermal contraction. The iron pipe didn't just leak, it shattered. A cloud of supercooled vapor and scalding steam erupted downward, creating a blinding whiteout in the basement. Julian screamed as the vapor seared his lungs and eyes. He fired blindly, the bullet ricocheting off a concrete pillar and whining into the darkness. Ji-Hu lunged through the mist, a heavy, silencing blow to Julian's temple that sent the younger man sprawling across the wet concrete floor. Ji-Hu didn't check for a pulse. He grabbed Amara's hand and pulled her into the dark, yawning throat of the steam tunnel. "Is he—" Amara started, her breath hitching. "He's alive," Ji-Hu said, his voice grim and final. "But he's not following us tonight. Move, Amara. The Syndicate will have the backup generators online in 5 minutes. We need to be a mile away before the trackers start pinging." They ran through the tunnels, the sound of their own footsteps echoing like frantic heartbeats. The air became cooler, smelling of the damp, ancient earth of Detroit. After what felt like hours, they reached a ladder that led to a nondescript manhole cover in an alleyway 3 blocks from the stadium. They emerged into the rain. The stadium was a dark, silent silhouette against the sky, the lights still dead, the crowd's confusion a distant, humming murmur that drifted over the city. A black SUV hissed to a halt at the end of the alley. Min-ho jumped out, his tactical vest torn and his face bloodied, but his expression was one of pure, unadulterated relief. "Boss, Amara, get in! The Syndicate is blocking the Ambassador Bridge. We have to head north through the Highland Park corridors before they close the net." As the SUV sped away from the stadium, Amara sat in the back, the leather-bound folder in her lap. She opened it, looking at her father's signature. Beside it, she saw a small note written in her mother's elegant, flowing script. "For the girl who will bring the sun back to Detroit." Amara looked out the window. The neighborhoods they were passing through were still dark, but in her hand she held the blueprint for the Woodward Grid, the real one, the one that couldn't be patented, stolen, or shut off by a man in a suit. "We did it," she whispered. Ji-Hu looked at her through the rearview mirror. "We survived, Amara, but Julian Vane isn't his father. He's smarter, and he's much more vengeful. He won't go to a cell quietly. He'll come for the Foundation with everything the old guard has left. This wasn't the end of the war. It was just the heist that gave us the ammunition to fight it." Amara nodded, her eyes hardening. "Then let them come. I'm done scrubbing their floors. From now on, they're going to have to learn how to live in my light." The SUV turned onto Woodward Avenue, the headlights cutting through the Detroit rain, moving toward a future that was no longer written in the old guard's ink. The aftermath of the stadium heist did not result in the quiet victory Amara had hoped for. By the time the Foundation SUV crossed the city limits and retreated into the high-tech sanctuary of their headquarters, the digital world was already in a violent tectonic shift. Amara's global broadcast of the original Vance blueprints had acted like a virus of truth, infecting every legal database and patent office from Washington, D.C. to Geneva. But the old guard's response was not a white flag. It was a global scorched earth policy. "Look at the news cycle," Chon-ho said, his voice grim as he pointed to the wall of monitors in the Situation Room. The ticker tapes were screaming in frantic red pulses. Detroit bioterror, Vance patents linked to lethal contamination. Julian Vane had played his final, most desperate card. By intentionally corrupting the public servers moments before the heist, he had ensured that the free data Amara released was perceived as a lethal weapon. Reports were flooding in of small-scale labs in Mumbai and Sao Paulo halting production because the chemical ratios provided in the leak were causing massive equipment failures. It was a masterclass in disinformation. He's not just attacking the patent, Amara realized, her heart sinking as she watched a prominent health official on a live feed call for her immediate arrest. He's attacking the very idea of open-source medicine. If he makes people afraid of the truth, they'll run back to the safety of the Aegis-Alpha monopoly, even if it costs them their life savings. He's poisoning the well so no one else can drink.
Ji-Hoon stood in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on a different set of monitors, the private security feeds surrounding the building. The media is the least of our problems, Amara. The Vulture Syndicate has officially declared the Foundation a hot zone to justify a total blackout. They've bypassed the local police entirely. Look at the perimeter. They're not waiting for a court order. Through the rain-streaked cameras, Amara saw 3 gray, windowless tactical transport trucks pulling onto the sidewalk with military precision. Men in the same slate-gray suits Julian had worn at the stadium were offloading heavy, reinforced crates. These weren't just mercenaries, they were high-end corporate liquidators, the kind of men who made whole companies disappear overnight. They were setting up a blockade, cutting off every exit and entry point. "They're going to siege us," Min-ho said, checking the charge on his tactical rifle with a rhythmic metallic snap. And because of the bioterror narrative, the authorities won't intervene. The police will stay 10 blocks away in a quarantine perimeter and let the syndicate sanitize the building. They've turned our sanctuary into a cage. Amara looked at the leather-bound folder on the table. The blueprints were the key to the future, but they were useless if she couldn't prove the data was clean. She turned to Kaylin, her eyes hardening with a sudden, sharp resolution. "We need to broadcast a live, real-time chemical verification. I need to synthesize a batch of the Vance insulin right here on camera, showing the world every microgram of the process. I have to prove the corruption was Julian's, not my father's. I have to show them the math doesn't lie." "You want to do a live-streamed lab experiment while an army is trying to kick down the door?" Kaylin asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and terror. "It's the only way to stop the backlash," Amara replied, her voice gaining a strength that silenced the room. "Ji-Hoon, I need 2 hours. Can you hold the lobby for 2 hours?" Ji-Hoon looked at the monitors, then at the woman who had transformed from a victim to a revolutionary. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "I've held back worse for less, Amara. Min-ho, activate the black box protocols, seal the elevator shafts, and flood the secondary stairwells with non-lethal deterrents. Amara, get to your lab. If the world is watching, make sure you don't miss a single decimal point." The first breach attempt came at exactly 2 a.m. The syndicate didn't use a battering ram. They used a high-frequency acoustic pulse that shattered the Foundation's front glass doors into a million diamond-like shards in a single concussive second. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that rattled the glassware in Amara's lab 4 floors up. Ji-Hoon and Min-ho were waiting in the lobby, positioned behind the reinforced granite reception desk. The darkness was absolute, lit only by the rhythmic red strobing of the building's emergency lights. "Targeted fire only," Ji-Hoon commanded over the comms. "We don't have the ammunition for a spray. Make every round a statement." The gray-suited liquidators entered through the broken glass, moving in a silent, professional sweep. They used thermal goggles and suppressed submachine guns, their movements perfectly synchronized. They weren't looking for a heroic stand, they were looking for a completion of a contract. A firefight erupted in the lobby, a staccato of muzzle flashes that illuminated the room in brief, violent bursts of orange and white. Ji-Hoon moved like a shadow, his sidearm barking with clinical precision as he picked off the lead syndicate operatives. Min-ho held the stairs, his tactical rifle providing a wall of suppression that forced the mercenaries to take cover behind the heavy leather sofas of the lounge. "They're using gas," Min-ho shouted as a series of metallic canisters clattered across the marble floor. "Masks on, now," Ji-Hoon replied. Green smoke, the syndicate's signature incapacitant, began to fill the lobby. It was a high-grade nerve agent designed to paralyze the central nervous system in seconds. Ji-Hoon felt the familiar weight of the tactical respirator on his face. Through the green haze, Ji-Hoon saw the syndicate leader, a tall, lean man with a cybernetic eye that glowed a faint, malevolent red. This was the Vulture's primary cleaner, a man known only as the Auditor. "Thorne," the Auditor's voice echoed through the lobby, amplified by his helmet's external speakers. "The girl is a bioterror. Step aside and we might leave you enough of your reputation to retire on. Don't die for a chemist." "You're in the wrong city, cleaner," Ji-Hoon replied, his voice a low growl through the mask. "In Detroit, we don't retire. We just get harder to kill." 4 floors above the carnage, the lab was a bright, sterile island of sanity. Kaylin had managed to hack into a global satellite uplink, bypassing the Syndicate's jammers by using the Woodward Grid's own internal frequency. "We're live," Kaylin whispered, his hands shaking as he adjusted the camera. 3 million viewers and climbing. Every major news network is picking up the feed. The world is watching, Amara. Amara stood in front of the camera.
Her lab coat pristine, her hands rock steady. Behind her, the massive centrifuge was humming a low, steady tune, and the mass spectrometer was already beginning to display its results. "My name is Amara Vance," she began, her voice calm and resonant, cutting through the distant, muffled sound of gunfire from the lobby below. "You have been told that the Vance patents are a weapon. You have been told that freedom has a price that only the elite can pay. I am here to show you that the only poison in this city is the greed of the people currently trying to break into this building." She moved with surgical precision, walking the camera through the molecular assembly of the insulin. She showed the original 1997 blueprint on one screen and the corrupted 2026 script Julian had injected on another. "The corruption Julian Vane injected relies on a false molecular weight," she explained, pointing to the data points. "If you adjust the binding agent by 0.04%, as shown in my father's original handwritten notes, the compound stabilizes perfectly. Watch the spectrometer. The math is universal." As the millions watched, the clear liquid in the beaker slowly turned a brilliant, translucent blue, the signature of pure, high-potency insulin. The readout on the screen confirmed the result in bold, green letters: purity 99.9%. No toxic byproducts detected.
The data is clean, Amara said, looking directly into the lens, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the medicine. The world is no longer a hostage. You don't have to choose between your health and your freedom. The Woodward convoy is moving, and we aren't stopping for Julian Vane or anyone else. The lobby was a wreck. Ji-Hu was down to his last magazine. The auditor had managed to flank the reception desk, and the green gas was becoming so thick that even the high-end respirators were starting to struggle. "Min-Ho, status!" Ji-Hu gasped, his lungs beginning to burn. "I'm out of ammo, boss. I'm moving to close quarters." Min-Ho's voice was ragged but unbroken. The auditor stepped over the desk, his SMG raised, his red cybernetic eye locked onto Ji-Hu. "The world doesn't care about your live stream, Thorne. They only care about what's left in the rubble after the sanitization is complete." Suddenly, the auditor's headset crackled with static. He paused, his head tilting to the side in confusion. Outside the building, the sound of a different kind of siren began to wail. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the marshals. It was the people. The live stream had worked. The residents of Brightmoor, Corktown, and Highland Park, the people who had seen the Woodward Grid flicker to life in their own streets, had seen the attempt on Amara's life. They hadn't stayed behind the quarantine perimeter. Thousands of people were flooding the streets, surrounding the syndicate trucks, their cell phone lights creating a massive sea of white that drowned out the syndicate's red tactical strobes. "We have to pull out," a voice screamed over the syndicate's open comms. "The crowd is too large. We're being boxed in. We can't engage civilians on a global feed." The auditor looked at Ji-Hu, then at the chaos of the thousands of faces outside the shattered windows. He lowered his weapon, his red eye flickering with a sudden, cold calculation. "This isn't a victory, Thorne. You've just turned a corporate war into a revolution, and revolutions always eat their own children first. We'll be seeing you again." The gray-suited mercenaries retreated, melting back into the rain as the crowds surged forward, not as attackers, but as a massive human shield for the Foundation. Amara walked down the stairs, meeting Ji-Hu in the middle of the ruined lobby. She was covered in the sweat and chemical scent of the lab. He was covered in the soot and grit of the fight. They looked at each other in the wreckage, and for the first time, they both realized the terrifying scale of what they had just unleashed. "We didn't just win the patents, did we?" Amara asked, her voice trembling with the realization. Ji-Hu looked at the thousands of faces outside the flashing lights, lit by the glowing streetlights of the Woodward Grid. "No, Amara. We just inherited the city, and now we have to figure out how to lead it."
The sun began to rise over Detroit, a real sun this time, warm and gold against the glass of the high-rises. The old guard was a memory. Julian Vane was a fugitive in the shadows, and the Woodward convoy was no longer a secret. It was the heartbeat of a new, unbroken Detroit. The dawn didn't bring rest. It brought a new kind of pressure. While the streets outside were still filled with the remnants of the human shield that had saved them, the internal systems of the Vance-Thorne Foundation were screaming. Julian Vane had retreated, but his departure was a tactical withdrawal, not a surrender. As the sun hit the charred remains of the lobby, Amara stood at the central console, watching the global reaction. The live stream had been clipped, translated, and shared 10 million times. The narrative was shifting, but the Vulture Syndicate was not done. "They're hitting the power grid," Kalen said, his voice dropping an octave as he stared at a cascading map of Detroit's electrical infrastructure. Julian's legal claim on the subsurface energy transfer protocol wasn't just a threat for the courtroom. He's initiated a remote override. Because the Woodward hubs are technically recognized as Vane logistics property by the municipal servers, he's triggered a system-wide surge. He's trying to blow the transformers in the neighborhoods we just lit up. Amara felt a surge of cold fury. He's going to punish the people for protecting us. If those transformers blow, it won't just be a blackout, it'll be a fire hazard for every home on the block. Ji-Hu, who had been cleaning a deep graze on his forearm, stood up. The exhaustion was etched into the lines of his face, but his eyes were like flint. He's trying to force a choice. We either surrender the source key blueprints to him, or he burns the city down to prove he still owns the switch. Min-Ho, how many teams do we have left? 2. Malik is at the Brightmoor hub, and Elena is holding the Highland Park corridor, but they're outnumbered. The utility company's rapid response teams are arriving, and they've got syndicate consultants embedded with them. They're coming to dismantle the hubs under the guise of public safety. Amara looked at the blue kinetic core, the device they'd stolen from the stadium. It was sitting on a lead-lined pedestal, its light dim but steady. "We don't have to surrender, and we don't have to let them blow the transformers. The kinetic core isn't just a battery, it's a regulator. My dad designed it to act as a buffer. If we can get this core to the primary substation at the old Packard plant, we can sink the surge Julian is sending. We can absorb the excess energy and feed it back into the hubs as a stabilized current." "The Packard plant is a kill box, Amara," Ji-Hu warned. "It's 10 acres of crumbling concrete and rusted iron. If the syndicate knows how the tech works, they'll be waiting for us there. It's the highest ground in that sector." "Then we make it a convoy," Amara said, her voice steady. "We don't sneak in this time. We go through the front door. We show the city that the Woodward convoy doesn't hide in the shadows anymore." The Packard plant was a jagged skeleton of Detroit's industrial past, a sprawling ruin that looked like a cathedral made of iron and wrought. The primary substation was located in the heart of the complex, a reinforced concrete bunker that had survived a century of neglect. The black SUVs of the convoy tore through the overgrown gates, the air thick with the scent of wet rust and impending violence. "Multiple heat signatures on the roof of the assembly wing," Min-Ho reported over the comms. "They've got high ground advantage, syndicate marksmen. They're using the Vulture drones, the quiet ones." Ji-Hu took the wheel of the lead vehicle, pushing the armored SUV to its limit as they swerved through the narrow canyons of brick. "Amara, stay in the center of the formation. Min-Ho, suppression fire on the north catwalks. Malik, engage the drones before they drop their payloads." The battle for the Packard plant was a symphony of chaos. The syndicate wasn't holding back. They used thermobaric charges to collapse the rusted sections of the roof, trying to pin the convoy in the rubble. The sound of high-caliber rounds echoing through the hollow factory floors was like a rhythmic, metallic thunder. Amara clutched the kinetic core in its transport case. She could feel the vibration through the floorboards. The power surge Julian had triggered was already hitting the city. The sky over the Packard plant was turning a strange, static-charged violet. "The surge is coming," Kalen screamed through her headset. 3 minutes until the Brightmoor transformers reach critical mass. If you don't plug that core into the sink, the whole grid goes dark. They reached the substation bunker, but the entrance was blocked by a wall of fire. The syndicate had rigged the oil-filled transformers at the gate to explode. Ji-Hu didn't slow down. He rammed the SUV through the flaming debris, the reinforced plating shrieking as it tore through the fire. "Go, Amara, go!" Ji-Hu shouted, kicking the door open and providing cover with a steady stream of fire. Amara sprinted into the bunker, the air inside cool and smelling of old grease. The substation was a massive array of copper bus bars and ceramic insulators. In the center was the sink, a specialized interface her parents had installed during the bank's secret renovation in the late 90s. She opened the transport case. The blue core was now pulsing violently, a sign that it was detecting the incoming surge. She reached for the interface cables, her fingers moving with a precision that ignored the sound of the world tearing itself apart outside. "I need to bridge the primary and the neutral," she shouted to herself, her mind a blur of electrical schematics. "The resistance is too high. I need a conductor." She looked at her brass key, the one from the floorboards. It was solid copper alloy, a relic of her family's history. Without hesitating, she jammed the key into the bridge slot, completing the circuit between the core and the city's grid. The bunker erupted in light. The kinetic core didn't just absorb the energy, it transformed it. The violet static in the sky was suddenly sucked downward, channeled through the Packard substation and into the core. For a second, Amara felt the entire power of Detroit's electrical heart beating through her hands. "Purge initiated!" she screamed. Instead of blowing the transformers in the neighborhoods, the energy was reflected back up the line. The syndicate's own command center, a mobile trailer parked 2 miles away where Julian Vane was watching the map, suddenly exploded in a shower of sparks and blue flame. The Woodward hubs in Brightmoor and Highland Park didn't fail. Instead, they glowed with a steady, unbreakable brilliance. The surge had been stabilized, cleaned, and returned to the people. Outside, the syndicate mercenaries began to scatter. Their equipment was fried, their drones falling from the sky like dead birds. The auditor, seeing the violet light erupting from the substation, realized the contract was no longer fulfillable. He signaled the retreat. Ji-Hu stepped into the bunker, his silhouette framed by the fading blue glow. He looked at Amara, who was still holding the core, her hair standing on end from the static, the brass key glowing red-hot in the slot. "You did it," Ji-Hu said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You didn't just save the grid, you broke Julian's leash on the city." Amara pulled the key out, her hand shaking as the core was now a steady, calm blue. "The patents were the start, Ji-Hu, but the power, that's what makes us real. Julian isn't coming back from this. Not today."
He won't come back as a businessman, Ji-Hu agreed. But he's still a Vane. And Vanes don't stop until there's nothing left to burn. Amara looked at the glowing city on the horizon. "Then we'll just have to build faster than he can burn." The silence that followed the reverse surge was heavier than the gunfire had been. In the hollowed-out belly of the Packard plant substation, Amara stood paralyzed, her hand still hovering over the glowing brass key. The air was thick with the scent of ionized ozone, a sharp, metallic tang that tasted like pennies on the tongue. Outside, the violet storm had vanished, replaced by a deep, midnight blue sky that looked unnervingly peaceful. For the first time since the rescue on the pharmacy steps, the hum of the city felt right. It wasn't the erratic, jagged rhythm of a dying machine, it was a steady, low-frequency pulse of a heartbeat being restored.
"Amara, let go of the interface," Ji-Hu said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that pulled her back to the present. He stepped toward her, his heavy boots crunching on the glass shards of shattered insulators. He reached out, gently but firmly prying her fingers away from the copper bridge. Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her muscles spasmed, a delayed reaction to the massive static charge that had just passed through the room. She looked down at her palms. They were red and tingling, but the skin was unbroken. The feedback loop. I could feel it, Ji-Hu. I could feel every hub in the city. It wasn't just data. It was like I could see the light turning on in every window in Brightmoor. Julian didn't just lose his servers, he lost his grip on the narrative. He can't claim he's the only one who can manage the grid if I just used his own energy to stabilize it. Ji-Hu didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the small cylindrical kinetic core. The blue light within it was no longer pulsing with a frantic violet edge. It was a deep, calm azure, swirling slowly like a miniature galaxy. He lost a battle, but he didn't lose his resources.
Min-ho, report. What's the status of the syndicate retreat? They're burning their own footprints, Min-ho's voice crackled through the comms, though the signal was still fuzzy from the electromagnetic interference. The auditor's team is scuttling the mobile command trailers. They're using thermite to melt the hard drives. They aren't just leaving, they're erasing any physical link to Vane logistics. By the time the sun comes up, the lawyers will be able to argue that Julian Vane was never even in the state. He doesn't need to be in the state to pull the trigger, Ji-Hu muttered, his eyes narrowing. Amara, the Foundation isn't safe. The crowd saved us tonight, but a crowd is a temporary shield. Julian is going to pivot. If he can't own the power, he'll try to make the power illegal. He's going to use the governor's office. As the convoy pulled away from the Packard plant, the city of Detroit was a patchwork of light. The Woodward Grid was holding, a brilliant white vein cutting through the darkness. Inside the lead SUV, the atmosphere was clinical and tense. Amara had her laptop open, but she wasn't looking at chemistry. She was looking at the donors list for the State Energy Commission. "Look at the names," she said, her voice tight with a new kind of exhaustion. Vane Logistics, Aegis-Alpha, the Vulture Syndicate's various shell companies. Julian doesn't just pay the governor's campaign, he pays the salaries of the people who write the safety regulations. He's already filed for a state of emergency regarding the Woodward Grid. He's calling it a public utility crisis. He's going to try to seize the hubs under eminent domain, Chan-ho added from the remote link at the Foundation. His argument will be that while the technology might be yours, the distribution is a state risk. If the governor signs that executive order, the National Guard will be the ones coming to dismantle the Woodward Grid, not the syndicate, and you can't shoot the National Guard. Ji-Hu looked out the window at the passing neighborhoods. People were standing on their porches, pointing at the glowing streetlights. They were smiling. "The law is a weapon," Ji-Hu said, "but only if the people believe in it. Julian is playing a game of paper. We need to play a game of reality. Amara, how fast can you scale the source key blueprints?" "I've already uploaded them to a decentralized server, but the blueprints alone aren't enough. You need the kinetic core to stabilize the hubs. Without the core, the grid is vulnerable to the same surges Julian just tried, and there's only one core." "Then we make the core the city's heart," Ji-Hu said. "We don't keep it at the Foundation. We put it somewhere they can't touch without starting a civil war." The convoy didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, it moved toward the Detroit Institute of Arts. The massive marble structure was a fortress of culture, but it was also the highest ground in the Midtown sector. More importantly, it was a building that the city council and the governor wouldn't dare raid with tactical teams. "The roof," Amara directed as they bypassed the security gates. "There's an old radio tower. If we mount the core there, it can act as a wireless regulator for every hub within a 10-mile radius. It becomes a broadcast tower for freedom." They moved through the darkened museum, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. They passed the murals of industry, the depictions of the very workers whose descendants were now relying on Amara's light. They reached the roof, the wind whipping Amara's lab coat around her legs. The city was spread out below them, a sea of potential. Ji-Hu helped her hoist the core into the transmitter housing. As she began the final wiring, the sound of helicopters began to thrum in the distance, not the quiet drones of the syndicate, but the heavy, rhythmic beat of military-grade Blackhawks. "The National Guard," Min-ho said, his voice flat. "Julian got the order signed. They're coming to secure the DIA and the Foundation." Amara's fingers didn't shake. She had lived her life in a kitchen where a single mistake meant a burn or a blow. She was used to working under the shadow of a monster. She twisted the final conductor, the brass key acting as the final bridge once again. "Let them come," Amara whispered. She hit the activation switch. The DIA didn't just light up, it became a lighthouse. A beam of pure blue light shot upward from the transmitter, a column of kinetic energy that acted as a beacon for the entire Woodward Grid. Across the city, every hub responded, their light intensifying, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the core's blue glow. The helicopters circled, but they didn't land. The pilots were staring at the beam. The world was staring at the beam. Inside the cockpit of the lead Blackhawk, the governor of Michigan was on a secure line with Julian Vane. "Julian, look at the sky," the governor shouted. "I can't send troops into a light show. The entire city is out on their lawns. If I touch that building now, I'll be the most hated man in the country by breakfast." Julian's voice came through the line, no longer polished or academic. It was the raw, jagged sound of a man who was losing everything he had spent a lifetime building. It doesn't matter. The technology is stolen. The patents are mine. Take the building or the Vulture Syndicate will pull the funding for your entire party. The syndicate is gone, Julian, the governor replied, his voice turning cold. The feds just raided the stadium. They found the cold storage vault you left open. They found the records of the insurance fraud from '98. They found your father's signature on the crash witness reports. I'm rescinding the emergency order. You're on your own. Amara stood on the roof of the DIA, watching the helicopters bank away. She felt the weight of the last 24 hours finally begin to settle, a massive, crushing fatigue that made her knees feel weak. Ji-Hu stepped up beside her. He looked at the blue beam, then at the girl who had changed the world with a chemical kit and a brass key. You did it, Amara. The old guard is dead, Julian is a ghost, and the city is finally ours. Amara looked at her hands. They weren't the hands of a maid anymore. They were the hands of a protector. It's not ours, Ji-Hu, she said softly. It's theirs. We're just the ones who made sure they could see to find it. But as they looked out over the glowing Detroit, a small red light flickered on a building 3 blocks away. A single, silent drone, unmarked and untraceable, hovered in the dark with its camera fixed on Amara's face. The Vulture Syndicate didn't care about governors. They didn't care about light shows. They had a prepaid contract, and in the shadows of the new Detroit, a new contract was being written. The blue beam rising from the Detroit Institute of Arts was more than a technical victory. It was a psychological anchor for a city that had spent decades adrift in the dark. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Detroit River in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, the reality of their position set in. Amara stood on the roof, the wind whipping her hair into a frantic halo, her eyes locked on the distant retreating silhouettes of the National Guard helicopters. The immediate legal threat had evaporated with the governor's phone call, but the air still felt charged with a lingering predatory static. The governor is a weather vane, Ji-Hu said, standing a few paces behind her, his eyes never leaving the surrounding rooftops. He pointed towards Julian when the wind smelled like money, and he's pointing towards you now because the wind smells like a riot. But don't mistake his retreat for an alliance. He's just clearing the field so he doesn't get caught in the crossfire. Amara turned to look at him. The blue light of the core cast long, cinematic shadows across the stone roof. I don't need his alliance, Ji-Hu. I need the time to stabilize the foundation. The world is watching this light. Every lab that saw my stream is currently recalibrating their chemistry. The poison patent narrative is dying, but Julian is still out there, and he has nothing left to lose but his life. He doesn't have his life, Ji-Hu corrected, his voice a low, grim rumble. He has his contract. The Vulture Syndicate doesn't offer refunds, and they don't accept failure. If Julian can't deliver the city to them, he becomes the liability they have to liquidate. He's a cornered animal, Amara, and cornered animals don't care about the light. Back inside the Foundation's command center, the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of a heist to the cold, clinical precision of a permanent government. Kalen was slumped in his chair, his fingers still twitching over the keys, while Chan-Ho sat at the main table, a stack of physical documents in front of him. The source key folder, the one pulled from the stadium vault, was open, its pages glowing under the LED lamps. It's not just blueprints, Chan-Ho said, his voice hushed with a sense of historical weight. Amara, look at the final page. This wasn't just signed by your father. It was witnessed by a third party, someone who wasn't part of the Vane family or the Vance family. Amara leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the faded ink at the bottom of the 1997 document. Her heart stopped. The signature was elegant, precise, and hauntingly familiar. Dr. Elena Thorne, Amara whispered. She looked up at Ji-Hu, her breath hitching. Your mother, she was my father's head of research. She wasn't just a witness, she was the architect of the kinetic core's biological interface. That's why the core reacts to my touch. It's coded to our combined DNA. Our families weren't just business partners, they were building this for us.
Ji-Hu walked to the table, his face a mask of profound, unreadable emotion. He touched the signature of his mother, a woman who had disappeared in the same accident that took Amara's parents. The realization hit the room like a physical shock. The Woodward convoy wasn't a new alliance, it was the resumption of a mission that had been interrupted by a generation of greed.
My mother didn't die in a car crash, Ji-Hu said, his voice dropping to a whisper of pure ice. She was taken because she refused to give Sang-wook the biometric override. They've spent 20 years trying to find a way to make this technology work without us, and now that we've found each other, the machine is finally complete. The peace of the morning was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the city's awakening. It wasn't a siren or a shout, it was the high-pitched electronic whine of a massive localized EMP. The monitors in the Foundation Command Center flickered, hissed with static, and then died. The lights overhead went dark. "They're here," Min-ho shouted, his weapon clearing his holster. "Main entrance. They didn't use the doors. They came through the loading docks with a thermal ram." The Vulture Syndicate's primary cleaner, the auditor, wasn't waiting for the shadows anymore. He had been given the order to sanitize the entire Vance-Thorne operation, regardless of the cost. He entered the lobby with a team of 12 ghosts, men whose identities had been erased, whose only purpose was the fulfillment of the contract. "Julian is gone," the auditor's voice boomed through the darkened hallways, amplified by his tactical helmet. "The Syndicate is now the sole executor of the Vance estate. Drop your weapons and the girl survives as a biological asset. Resist and we level the block." Ji-Hu grabbed Amara, pulling her toward the emergency staircase. "Kaylin, Min-ho, get to the sub-basement. Use the steam tunnels to lead them into the Corktown trap. Amara, you're with me. We're going to the roof." "The roof?" Amara asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We'll be trapped." "We aren't trapping ourselves," Ji-Hu said, his eyes burning with a dark final resolve. "We're bringing them to the core." The final confrontation took place on the roof of the Foundation, under the pale, cold light of a Detroit dawn. The auditor and his remaining ghosts stepped onto the gravel, their weapons trained on Ji-Hu and Amara. Ji-Hu stood at the edge of the roof, his back to the city, his hands raised. Amara stood beside him, clutching a small pressurized vial, the last of her experimental compounds. "You've reached the end of the line, Thorne," the auditor said, his red cybernetic eye glowing with a predatory intensity. "The core is at the DIA, the patents are in the wind, and your army is at the bottom of the building. Give me the biometric override, and I'll make your death quick." "I don't have an override," Ji-Hu said, a strange, calm smile touching his lips. "But I have a partner, and she's very good at chemistry." Amara didn't hesitate. She didn't throw the vial at the auditor. She threw it into the Foundation's own primary ventilation intake located on the roof. "What did you do?" the auditor hissed, stepping forward. "I didn't use a poison," Amara said, her voice clear and steady. "I used a catalytic oxidizer. In exactly 10 seconds, the air inside this building is going to become 400% more oxygenated. It's not lethal to breathe, but it makes every electronic circuit in your suits and your weapons highly flammable. One spark, one trigger pull, and you become a human firework." The auditor paused, his finger hovering over the trigger of his SMG. He looked at his own HUD. It was already flashing orange. The sensors were detecting the atmospheric shift. "You're bluffing," the auditor growled. "Try me," Amara replied. "The Woodward Grid is currently feeding a high-frequency surge into the building's grounding wires. The air isn't just oxygenated, it's ionized. You're standing in a tinderbox, and I'm the match." Ji-Hu stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the auditor's red lens. "The contract is over, Cleaner. The world saw the light. They saw the truth. If you kill us now, you die in a ball of fire on a global live stream. Is Julian's ghost worth that much to you?" The silence on the roof was absolute. For a long minute, the only sound was the wind and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the Woodward Grid. Finally, the auditor lowered his weapon. He signaled his men. "The Vulture Syndicate doesn't fight losing wars. But remember this, Amara Vance. You haven't destroyed the old guard. You've just become the new one, and everyone wants what the guard protects. The ghosts retreated, disappearing into the service elevator as the atmospheric sensors in the building began to stabilize. They were gone. Amara leaned against the roof's parapet, the adrenaline finally leaving her body in a sudden crashing wave. She looked out over Detroit. The city was awake now. The Woodward Grid was no longer a glowing blue beam. It was just the lights in the houses, the power in the factories, and the heartbeat of a people who were no longer afraid. Ji-Hu stood beside her, his hand resting on the stone. He looked at the folder in her hand, the one with their mother's signatures. "So," he said softly, "what happens now?" Amara looked at him, a tired but genuine smile touching her face. "Now we open the doors. We build the hospitals. We manufacture the insulin. We keep the promise our parents made in 1997. It's going to be a long road," Ji-Hu noted. "The syndicate will be back. The governor will try to find a new loophole. The world will always want a piece of what we have." Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key. She held it up, the morning sun reflecting off the worn metal. "Let them come. We have the light, we have the chemistry, and we have the convoy. Detroit isn't a ghost city anymore. It's home." As the sun fully rose, illuminating the skyline in a brilliant, unbreakable gold, the Woodward convoy began its next journey, not into the shadows of the past, but into the brilliance of the future.